firstborn sons. As is evident with Cain and Abel, in the Old Testament the younger son is often favored by God over the firstborn son. However, this is not always the case. For example, the firstborn son of Noah, Shem, is blessed by God with a long life, and does not, as a result, become sinfully proud of his status. For this reason, Shem is considered as one of the founders of the city of God. Abraham, points out Hahn, is yet another example of a firstborn son who is favored by God and remains a just, upright man. Although Israel as a nation is identified as the firstborn son of God in an adoptive sense, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. Unlike Shem and Abraham, Israel repeatedly becomes sinfully proud of its status and forgot that it is a firstborn son for the sake of the other nations, to lead them also to worship of the one true God. This was one of the reasons why Jesus became angry in the Jerusalem temple by overturning tables and chasing people out with the words, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Mark 11:17. As explained by James Mallon, in this verse, Jesus is quoting from Isaiah 56:6, in which Israel is portrayed as a house of prayer for all people and not just for the Israelites. In other words, Israel was given the firstborn status not for self-glorification, but rather so that they could lead their younger brothers and sisters represented by the non-Israelite nations to God for God's glory. Reflecting the ancient understanding of firstborn sons as leaders of their families after their father, Israel was to fulfill this adoptive role as firstborn among the nations by serving the other nations as priests who, asserts Hahn, mediate God's truthful love. Jesus became angry because these excessive money changing in the court of women close to the court of the Gentiles were a great distraction to the Gentiles and to women in a place intended by God for worship. Jesus held that many of his people had forgotten that they had been chosen as firstborn for the sake of all nations, and that consequently the temple was intended by God to be a temple of worship for all people, for all nations, and not just for Israelite men. Except for Adam, Israel as a nation, Noah, Shem, and Abraham, all other firstborn sons that are identified in the Old Testament, explains Hahn, are not specifically favored by God. Instead, God favors and blesses the younger son over the elder son, Abel instead of Cain, Isaac instead of Ishmael, Jacob instead of Esau, Perez instead of Zerah, Joseph instead of Reuben, Ephraim instead of Manasseh, David instead of Eliab. Just because God favors a younger son over the firstborn son does not mean God allows the younger son to abuse his privileged status without punishment. An example, indicates Hahn, is the account of Jacob's life. Jacob deceitfully stole his older brother's birthright by tricking his old, nearly blind father to think he was blessing the firstborn, Esau. Years later, God justly allows Jacob to experience what it feels to be similarly deceived when his uncle Laban tricks him to marry Leah instead of Rachel, whom Jacob loves and willingly works 7 more years to marry. Similarly, at the end of his life, Jacob is once again deceived in a similar way that he fooled his father. In chapter 37 of Genesis, Joseph's brother tricks their father Jacob to think that his favorite son Joseph was killed by a wild animal. They do so by presenting to Jacob Joseph's robe in goat blood, while claiming they do not know what happened to their brother Joseph.